In the autumn of 1806, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte rode triumphantly through the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, positioned at the absolute summit of his power. He had just annihilated the Prussian military machine at the twin battles of Jena. 12 months earlier, he had obliterated the combined Austrian and Russian forces at Austria. The European continent belonged to him. From the Atlantic shores of France to the Russian frontier, monarchs and princes bent their knees before him. Europe's map was being redrawn according to his vision. To any observer standing in Berlin that autumn day, the French military juggernaut appeared unstoppable. It seemed the Corsican artillery officer had finally achieved absolute mastery over the continent. But Napoleon understood a truth that spectators could not see. He knew his triumph remained incomplete. Across the English Channel sat an adversary he could not vanquish with artillery barrages or cavalry charges. That enemy was Great Britain. For more than a decade, Britain had served as the persistent irritant against the French Revolution and later the French Empire. The British Treasury financed every coalition assembled against France. They paid the Russians to mobilize their armies. They paid the Austrians to engage in battle. They paid the Prussians to take up arms. London functioned as the central bank of the anti-Napoleon alliance, and defending this financial powerhouse was the Royal Navy. Just 1 year before his Berlin triumph, Napoleon had watched his entire naval force destroyed at Trafalgar. Admiral Nelson had obliterated the combined French and Spanish fleets in a single afternoon engagement. That catastrophic defeat rendered any invasion of England physically impossible. Napoleon could not cross the Channel. He was a tiger trapped on land, staring at a shark that commanded the seas. Napoleon recognized that if military victory over Britain was impossible, he would have to achieve economic victory instead. He analyzed the British system with the precision of a mathematician studying an equation. He observed that British power originated not from territorial size or population, both substantially smaller than France, but from commerce. It originated from trade. It originated from credit. Britain had become the workshop of the industrial world and the merchant prince of the oceans. They imported raw materials from their colonial territories, transformed them into manufactured products in their factories, and exported them across Europe. This commercial activity generated the gold reserves that sustained the British pound. That gold paid the sailors manning the Royal Navy. That gold subsidized the armies of Austria, Prussia, and Russia. Napoleon believed the British economy resembled a house of cards constructed on debt and exports. He famously dismissed them as a nation of shopkeepers. He believed that if he could simply close the shop, if he could prevent British merchandise from being sold anywhere in Europe, the British economy would implode. The banks in London would fail catastrophically. The currency would become worthless paper. The government would lack funds to maintain its fleet. The shark would starve in the water. So in November 1806, seated in the conquered palace of Prussian kings in Berlin, Napoleon signed the most ambitious and dangerous decree of his reign. History remembers it as the Berlin Decree. With a single stroke of his pen, he proclaimed the British Isles under a state of blockade. He prohibited all trade whatsoever with Great Britain. No British vessel could enter any port controlled by the French Empire or its satellite states. No British goods could be purchased or sold anywhere on the continent. Any British subject discovered on French-controlled territory would become a prisoner of war. Any British property would be immediately confiscated. Even personal letters written in the English language were to be seized and destroyed. This was the birth of the continental system. It represented the first total economic warfare campaign in modern history. Napoleon was attempting to weaponize the entire European coastline against a single island nation. He was trying to conquer the ocean by controlling the land. The scope of this vision was breathtaking in its audacity. It required absolute control over every harbor, every river mouth, every fishing village from the Baltic Sea, in the north, to the Mediterranean, in the south. It meant a merchant in Amsterdam could no longer sell cheese to London. It meant a winemaker in Bordeaux could no longer export claret to Bristol. It meant a timber merchant in Russia could no longer supply masts to the Royal Navy. Initially, the strategy appeared successful. The British economy panicked. Exports to continental Europe plummeted. Warehouses in London and Liverpool overflowed with unsold inventory. Cotton, sugar, coffee, and manufactured goods accumulated on the docks with nowhere to go. Riots erupted in the industrial towns of northern England as factories reduced production and workers lost their employment. The value of the British pound wavered uncertainly. It seemed the emperor had discovered the Achilles heel of his enemy. But Napoleon had fundamentally underestimated the complexity of the global economic system. He had underestimated the relentless power of supply and demand. By prohibiting British goods, he wasn't merely damaging Britain. He was inflicting severe harm on his own subjects. Europe had grown dependent on goods that only Britain and her colonial empire could provide. The people of Europe craved coffee from the Caribbean plantations. They wanted sugar. They wanted tobacco from Virginia. They wanted affordable cotton textiles from Manchester mills to clothe their families. They wanted indigo dye for military uniforms and civilian clothing. Britain controlled the seas, which meant Britain controlled access to all these tropical commodities. When Napoleon signed his decree, he effectively transformed these everyday necessities into contraband. He criminalized a cup of coffee. He made wearing a cotton shirt an illegal act. Almost immediately, prices for these goods skyrocketed across the continent. In Paris, sugar prices surged by 400%. In Hamburg, coffee became a luxury only the super wealthy could afford. The cotton industry in France, which Napoleon had hoped would replace British manufacturing entirely because it couldn't obtain the raw cotton bales transported on British merchant ships. The continental system had been designed to strangle Britain economically. Instead, it began strangling Europe. The French economy, which was supposed to flourish without British competition, found itself paralyzed. French port cities like Bordeaux and La Rochelle, which had thrived on Atlantic trade, transformed into ghost towns. Grass began growing in the streets of Amsterdam. The shipyards of Hamburg fell silent. The docks collected dust. Napoleon had promised his people that the blockade would deliver swift peace and prosperity. Instead, it delivered crushing inflation and widespread shortages. He was attempting to fight economic laws with imperial laws. He believed that his will alone was sufficient to redirect the flow of global commerce. He dispatched customs officers to patrol every port. He created a massive bureaucratic army of border guards and intelligence agents to hunt down British contraband. He ordered that any British cloth discovered in Europe should be burned in public squares as a demonstration. Bonfires of confiscated goods illuminated cities across Europe. People watched in horror and disbelief as millions of francs worth of shoes, coats, textiles, and sugar were incinerated by French soldiers, while the citizens themselves shivered in inadequate clothing and faced food shortages. This didn't resemble liberation. It resembled madness. The merchant class of Europe, which had initially welcomed Napoleon as a modernizing force who would streamline trade and eliminate feudal restrictions, began turning against him. They were businessmen, not warriors. They didn't care about French glory or defeating the British aristocracy. They cared about their ledgers. They cared about profit margins and inventory turnover. And under the continental system, no legitimate profit could be made, so they turned to illegitimate methods. Napoleon had inadvertently created the most massive and sophisticated criminal enterprise in recorded history. Continental-wide smuggling operations. The European coastline stretches thousands of miles. It's filled with hidden coves, secluded inlets, and remote islands. Policing it comprehensively was impossible. The moment the Berlin Decree was signed, a vast shadow economy sprang into existence to replace the legal one. Smugglers became folk heroes. Fishermen converted their boats into blockade runners. They would rendezvous with British ships in international waters under cover of darkness, transfer cargo and slip back into French, Dutch, or Italian ports before dawn. The British government actively encouraged this underground trade. They understood that Napoleon was attempting to drain Britain of gold reserves, so they used their gold to systematically break his system. They established a massive smuggling depot on the tiny island of Heligoland in the North Sea, just off the German coast. Heligoland became the warehouse of the resistance against Napoleon's economic war. The British fortified the island and filled its warehouses with contraband goods. Hundreds of vessels docked there weekly. German smugglers would row out at night in small boats, load up with coffee, sugar, textiles, and manufactured goods, then vanish into the river estuaries and coastal waterways. It was said only half-jokingly that you could purchase British goods more easily in Hamburg than in London itself, provided you were willing to pay the premium price demanded by smugglers. Even Napoleon's own military could not survive without trading with the enemy. When the French army marched into Poland to engage Russian forces in the brutal winter of 1807, the soldiers were freezing. They desperately needed overcoats. The French textile industry could not produce sufficient quantities. The quartermasters faced an impossible situation. They had no choice. They secretly purchased 50,000 overcoats from British merchants operating through Dutch intermediaries. The soldiers of the Grand Army marched to war, wearing wool woven in Yorkshire mills and boots made from leather tanned in England, paid for with French gold that ultimately ended up deposited in the Bank of London. The irony was absolute and devastating. Napoleon was attempting to bankrupt Britain, but his own war machine was subsidizing the British economy he sought to destroy. By 1808, the structural cracks in the continental system were visible to everyone except the emperor himself. He refused to acknowledge failure. He believed the blockade simply needed stricter enforcement. He believed that if he could just plug the remaining holes, Britain would collapse. He didn't realize that the harder he squeezed, the more the sand slipped through his fingers. He was transforming the entire continent into an economic prison, and he was the warden, while the prisoners were beginning to riot. The stage was set for a tragedy that would not merely destroy economies, but would consume the empire itself in fire and ice. The first major crack in Napoleon's economic wall appeared in the southwest, on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. Portugal was a small kingdom, but it played a disproportionately significant role in the global economy. For centuries, it had maintained the oldest continuous alliance with Great Britain. The Portuguese economy was almost entirely integrated with Britain's. They exchanged their port wine for British wool and manufactured goods. Their economies were intertwined, like DNA strands. To demand that Portugal join the continental system, and Bano Bristre wasn't asking for a shift in foreign policy. It was demanding national economic suicide. When Napoleon insisted that the Portuguese Prince Regent close his ports to British vessels and confiscate all British property, the prince refused outright. He simply could not comply. His treasury would be empty within a month. His people would starve. Napoleon did not hesitate for a moment. In 1807, he ordered a French army to march across Spain to invade Portugal. He was determined to plug this leak in his economic dam. But this decision triggered a catastrophic chain of events that would bleed the French Empire dry, both literally and financially. To reach Portugal, the French army had to traverse Spain. Spain was technically a French ally, but a weak and unstable one. Napoleon looked at the Spanish monarchy and saw incompetence and corruption. He observed a country that wasn't enforcing the blockade with sufficient strictness, so he made a catastrophic calculation. He decided to remove the Spanish king and install his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne. He thought he was appointing a reliable manager to oversee the blockade more effectively. Instead, he kicked a hornet's nest that would never stop stinging. The Spanish people erupted in a ferocious guerrilla war. It was warfare unlike anything Napoleon had encountered before. There were no grand set-piece battles to win that would end the conflict decisively. It was war by ambush, by sabotage, by assassination. Supply convoys were raided on dark roads. Tax collectors were murdered in their beds. French soldiers disappeared in village streets, their bodies discovered days later. Historians call this conflict the Spanish Ulcer. It became a bottomless pit that consumed French soldiers and French gold with no end in sight. To maintain the occupation, Napoleon had to station hundreds of thousands of troops in Spain indefinitely. These troops required payment, food, and clothing. The expenses were staggering. Typically, Napoleon financed his wars through systematic looting of conquered territories. But Spain was desperately poor. The wealth of Spain had always flowed from its American colonies, the galleons, carrying silver from Mexican and Peruvian mines. But because of the British naval blockade choking Spanish sea lanes, that silver could no longer reach Spain. The treasure fleet was cut off completely, so France had to pay the entire bill. For the first time in Napoleon's reign, the flow of wealth reversed direction. Instead of money flowing from conquered lands into Paris, money was hemorrhaging out of Paris to prop up a failing occupation in Madrid. The continental system, which had been designed to enrich France at Britain's expense, was now systematically draining France itself. While the war in Spain raged endlessly, economic pressure on the opposite side of Europe was reaching a critical breaking point. The Russian Empire formed the eastern pillar of Napoleon's continental system. Tsar Alexander I had agreed to join the blockade under the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. He had promised to cease selling goods to the British. He had pledged to close Russian ports to British shipping. But the Russian economy operated on fundamentally different principles than the French economy. France was primarily agricultural and could feed itself from domestic production. Russia was a resource exporter. The entire wealth of the Russian nobility class that supported the Tsar's authority came from selling raw materials to Great Britain. They sold timber to the Royal Navy for shipmasts. They sold hemp for rope production. They sold tallow for candles and grain for bread. Britain was their largest customer by an enormous margin, purchasing nearly half of all Russian exports. When the Tsar closed the ports in compliance with the continental system, the Russian economy crashed spectacularly. The value of the Russian ruble collapsed, losing half its value in just 3 years. The price of coffee and sugar in St. Petersburg reached astronomical levels that made them inaccessible to all but the wealthiest aristocrats. The Russian nobles who lived on their vast country estates found themselves in a devastating position. Land-rich, but cash poor, they couldn't sell their harvests, which meant they couldn't service their debts. Angry murmuring began in the winter palaces of St. Petersburg. The nobles reminded the Czarnin too subtly of what had happened to his father, Paul I, who had been assassinated after he severed trade relations with Britain. The implication was crystal clear. If Alexander did not restore trade, the nobility would restore it themselves by installing a new Tsar. Alexander begged Napoleon for relief. He requested permission to trade with neutral American vessels so Russia could export its timber and agricultural products. Napoleon refused categorically. He was rigid and uncompromising. He believed that any leak in the system would ultimately save Britain. He told the Tsar bluntly that Russia must suffer for the greater good of defeating England. But while Napoleon was demanding economic sacrifice from his allies, he was secretly betraying his own system. This ultimate hypocrisy would shatter the alliance. By 1810, the French economy itself had descended into deep recession. Textile mills in Lyon and Normandy were shuttering because they couldn't obtain raw cotton. Customs revenues were collapsing because there was no legal trade to tax. The treasury was running dry. Napoleon needed money desperately to fund his armies and maintain his empire. So he devised a cynical solution that exposed the entire continental system as a fraud. He began issuing special trading licenses. These licenses allowed French merchants to trade with Britain legally. They could export French wine, silk, and luxury goods to London, and in return they could import essential commodities like indigo dye and Baltic timber. The merchants paid massive fees to the French treasury for these licenses. It was state-sanctioned smuggling. It was a protection racket. Napoleon was effectively declaring that trading with Britain was illegal for everyone in Europe, except those who paid him for the privilege. When the Tsar discovered this duplicity, he was absolutely furious. He watched French ships carrying British goods sail into Russian ports, while Russian merchant vessels rotted at the docks, their owners facing bankruptcy. He realized with bitter clarity that the continental system was not a military strategy designed to defeat Britain. It was a protectionist racket designed to enrich France at everyone else's expense. In December 1810, the Tsar made his decisive move. He issued a ukase, a royal décret, that opened Russian ports to neutral shipping. Effectively, he was letting the British back in through a legal loophole. Simultaneously, he imposed heavy tariffs on French luxury goods, like wine and silk. It was an economic declaration of war against France. Russia had broken the blockade. The continental system was collapsing. Napoleon received this news in Paris with cold, calculated fury. He understood exactly what this meant. If Russia was permitted to trade with Britain, the entire blockade structure would disintegrate. British goods would flood into northern Europe via Russian ports. The British economy would recover completely. The continental system would dissolve into a... Napoleon felt he had no alternative. He had to enforce compliance. He had to respond like a customs enforcement officer who discovers a gaping hole in the fence. But because he was an emperor rather than a bureaucrat, he couldn't simply issue a fine or diplomatic protest. He had to send an army. Not just any army, the largest military force in human history, up to that point. He began assembling what would become known as the Grand Army. More than 600,000 men were gathered from every corner of his empire and satellite states. They were Frenchmen, Italians, Poles, Germans, Dutch, Swiss, and Austrians. It was a pan-European army marching under the French tricolor flag. The logistics of this invasion were driven by the same economic madness that had initiated it. To feed 600,000 men and tens of thousands of horses, Napoleon needed astronomical supplies. He couldn't rely on living off the land by foraging in the impoverished Russian countryside. He had to transport everything with him. He assembled thousands of supply wagons, herds of cattle, and mountains of grain stockpiles. But the cost was staggering beyond comprehension. To finance this massive mobilization, France had to squeeze its remaining allies even harder, forcing them to pay higher taxes and provide more conscript soldiers. The economy of Europe was being strip-mined to pay for what was essentially a police action to enforce a trade embargo against Russia. Napoleon's senior advisors warned him repeatedly. They told him Russia was too vast, too cold, and too poor to conquer successfully. They told him the British economy was already adapting brilliantly, discovering new export markets in South America and Asia to replace European trade. They told him bluntly that the blockade had failed and continuing was madness. But Napoleon could not turn back. He was a prisoner of his own economic logic and political commitments. He believed the only way to preserve his empire was to bankrupt Britain, and the only way to bankrupt Britain was to seal the Russian ports permanently. He had invested too much political capital in the continental system to admit it was a failure. On June 24, 1812, the Grand Army crossed the Niemen River into Russian territory. Napoleon did not tell his soldiers they were marching to enforce a trade embargo or close a tariff loophole. He told them they were marching for glory and honor. He told them they were marching to defend European civilization against barbaric Eastern despotism. But the brutal reality was far more mundane and infinitely more tragic. They were marching because a tariff policy had catastrophically failed. They were marching because the price of timber, hemp, and coffee had somehow become a matter of life and death for an empire. As the soldiers marched eastward, kicking up clouds of dust on the Russian plains under the scorching summer sun, they had no comprehension that they were walking into an economic black hole. They were about to discover that you cannot force a sovereign nation to conduct business with you at bayonet point. The invasion of Russia, which would ultimately result in the deaths of more than 500,000 men and the destruction of the French Empire, was not launched to capture strategic territory or eliminate a military threat. It was launched to close a bureaucratic loophole in a trade agreement. The tragedy of 1812 was that the greatest military genius in history destroyed himself, attempting to solve a problem that should have been resolved through diplomatic negotiation and a revised trade treaty. He tried to arrest the fundamental law of supply and demand with military force. In the end, economic law proved more powerful than imperial will. The snows of Russia were waiting to bury the Grand Army in frozen graves. But it was the ledger, booked accounting of costs versus benefits, that had already signed their death warrants before they ever crossed the border. The Grand Army that marched into Russia during the summer of 1812 represented the most expensive military asset ever assembled in human history. Up to that point, it was a moving metropolis of 600,000 men, 50,000 horses, and thousands of artillery pieces. In terms of human capital and military equipment, it represented the accumulated wealth of an entire decade of French conquests and taxation. Every musket, every uniform, every brass button, and every bushel of oats in the endless supply wagons had been paid for by the taxes and tributes extracted from a subjugated Europe. Napoleon believed he could execute a short, decisive campaign. His entire economic model of warfare relied on speed and shock. He would locate and destroy the Russian army in a massive, decisive battle near the border. He would force Tsar Alexander to surrender and immediately reintegrate Russia into the continental system before the notorious Russian winter arrived. It was a strategy predicated on rapid return on investment. But the Russians refused to cooperate with his timetable. They understood the economic vulnerabilities of the French position better than Napoleon did himself. They recognized that the Grand Army was a voracious beast that needed constant feeding. If they stood and fought, they might be defeated. But if they retreated methodically, they could let the Russian landscape itself destroy Napoleon's massive investment. So the Russian army fell back systematically, and as they retreated deeper into their vast territory, they systematically destroyed everything of value. This was the scorched earth palisadal economic warfare at the operational level. The Russian peasants, under orders from their commanders and landowners, burned their own crops in the fields. They demolished their own barns and storage facilities. They poisoned their own wells. They drove their cattle and livestock eastward, away from the advancing French columns. They effectively liquidated their own economic assets to prevent them from falling into enemy hands. When Napoleon's soldiers finally arrived in a village, hoping desperately to find food and shelter, they found only smoldering ash and oppressive silence. The Grand Army was marching into a desert of its own making. The intricate, logistical plan, crafted with such mathematical precision in Paris by Napoleon's staff, began disintegrating within mere weeks. The massive supply wagons, drawn by heavy oxen and draft horses, could not maintain pace with the forced marches of the infantry columns. The roads in Russia bore no resemblance to the paved highways of France. They were dirt tracks that transformed into impassable mud pits when it rained and created choking dust clouds when dry. The horses began dying in enormous numbers. This detail is often overlooked in traditional military histories, but economically, it represented the first unmistakable sign of bankruptcy. A trained cavalry horse was an extraordinarily expensive piece of military technology, requiring years of specialized training and consuming massive quantities of grain daily. As the supply line stretched ever longer and local forage disappeared due to the scorched earth tactics, the horses starved. By the time the army reached Smolensk in August, thousands upon thousands of horses had already perished not from enemy action, but from colic, exhaustion, and starvation. Without horses, the artillery couldn't be moved. Without horses, the cavalry couldn't conduct reconnaissance. The army was hemorrhaging its capital assets at a terrifying rate before it had even fought a single major engagement. Napoleon faced a critical strategic decision at Smolensk. His supply lines were strained far beyond their breaking point. His marshals and senior generals strongly advised him to halt the advance, winter in Smolensk, and systematically rebuild his logistics infrastructure before proceeding. It was the economically prudent choice. It would preserve the army as a functioning asset. But Napoleon was a compulsive gambler, chasing his mounting losses. He examined the balance sheets and saw only red ink spreading across the columns. He had spent an absolute fortune to advance this far into Russia. If he stopped now without achieving a decisive victory, the political cost would be absolutely ruinous. His reluctant allies in Prussia and Austria might defect from his coalition. The blockade against Britain would crumble completely. He desperately needed a tangible victory, a payout that would justify the enormous investment. He needed Moscow. He believed incorrectly that Moscow was the economic and emotional heart of the Russian Empire. If he captured the ancient holy city, the Tsar would be forced to negotiate surrender. Russia would sign a new treaty, re-enter the continental system, the blockade would be restored, and the entire war would pay for itself through the terms of peace. The investment would finally yield returns. So he pressed onward into the Russian interior. On September 7th, the two massive armies finally collided at Bordeaux. It became the bloodiest single day of combat in the entire Napoleonic Wars. It was a brutal slugfest of pure attrition and firepower. Napoleon technically won the field, but it was a Pyrrhic victory of the most devastating kind. He lost 30,000 men irreplaceable veterans who formed the core of his military expertise and capability. He expended ammunition stocks. He couldn't easily resupply thousands of miles from French arsenals. He was systematically damaging the very asset he was desperately trying to preserve. 1 week later, the exhausted French army crested the Poklanaya hill, and finally saw Moscow spread before them in the valley below. It appeared to be a glittering prize worthy of their suffering. The golden domes of the Kremlin shone brilliantly in the autumn sunlight, reflecting centuries of accumulated wealth. Napoleon waited expectantly at the city gates for a delegation of Russian boyars to emerge bearing the symbolic keys to the city, exactly as had happened in Berlin, Vienna, and every other European capital he had conquered. He waited patiently, and waited. No one came. The city remained eerily silent. The Russians had done the absolutely unthinkable. They had evacuated and abandoned their own ancient capital, the richest city in the empire, the spiritual center of Russian Orthodoxy. The storehouse of centuries of accumulated wealth and culture had been deliberately emptied. When French troops cautiously entered the city, they found it essentially deserted. They discovered grand palaces filled with elegant furniture and artwork, but no people. They found shops still stocked with luxury goods and fine items, but virtually no food supplies. They were like bank robbers who had successfully broken into the vault, only to discover that the vault's airlocks had automatically sealed them inside with their prize. Then the fires erupted. On the night of September 14th, fires began breaking out simultaneously across multiple districts of the city. Initially, the French assumed it was accidental perhaps, careless looting or knocked over candles. But the fires spread in patterns that defied natural explanation, moving against the wind direction. French soldiers discovered fuses, incendiary devices, and deliberate ignition points. The governor of Moscow, Konrad Rostopchin, had ordered the systematic destruction of the city. He had released criminals from the prisons and armed them with torches and combustibles, instructing them to burn Moscow to the ground, rather than let it shelter the French army. For 3 apocalyptic days and nights, Moscow burned. Napoleon stood at the Kremlin windows, watching in stunned disbelief as his prize incinerated before his eyes. He reportedly shouted in frustration, "What a people! They are Scythian. This is a war of extermination." The burning of Moscow represented the ultimate act of economic denial warfare. The Russians deliberately incinerated their own capital rather than permit it to serve as comfortable winter quarters for the French army. The warehouses of grain that Napoleon needed destroyed, the winter clothing supplies consumed by flames, the shelter from the approaching winter reduced to charred ruins. Everything Napoleon required to survive the approaching winter literally went up in smoke before his eyes. Napoleon remained in the smoking ruins of Moscow for 5 critical weeks. It was a fatal hesitation born of psychological denial. He was waiting desperately for a letter from Tsar Alexander. He simply could not believe that Alexander would continue fighting after losing his capital city. He was applying the diplomatic logic of Western European warfare to the Eastern theater, and it was catastrophically failing. He sent multiple peace offers to St. Petersburg. The Tsar didn't even acknowledge their receipt, much less respond. Alexander had famously declared, "Napoleon or I, he or I, we cannot reign together. One of us must fall." By mid-October, the first snowflakes began falling on the ruins. The brutal reality of the strategic situation finally pierced Napoleon's denial. He was sitting in a burned-out shell of a city, more than 1,000 miles from friendly territory, with no food reserves, no winter clothing, and an army that was rapidly disintegrating into an undisciplined mob of desperate looters. He had captured the asset he sought, but the asset had been deliberately rendered worthless. The investment had failed completely and catastrophically. On October 19, 1812, The Great Retreat began. It was not an organized military maneuver. It was a bankruptcy liquidation sale, conducted in desperation. Soldiers desperately attempting to salvage something of value from the disaster, loaded their packs with utterly useless loot from Moscow's ruins: silver candlesticks, silk tapestries, porcelain vases, jewelry boxes. They threw away their remaining food rations to carry gold and valuables. They were trying desperately to extract some monetary value from Russia, not comprehending the fundamental truth that you cannot eat gold when you're starving. As the Russian winter descended with its full legendary fury, the retreat transformed into an absolute horror story. Temperatures plummeted to -30°C and below. The looted treasures were abandoned along the roadside within days. The ornate silver candlesticks were traded for a single piece of horsemeat. The silk tapestries were torn up and wrapped around freezing feet as improvised insulation. The Grand Army, the most expensive and powerful military machine in Europe, was falling apart. The horses died first in massive numbers. They would slip on the ice and snow, unable to regain their footing. Starving soldiers would immediately rush upon any fallen horse and begin carving meat from its flanks, while the animal still lived and screamed. Without horses, the heavy artillery had to be abandoned. Hundreds of bronze cannons, the pride of French military industry and technology, were spiked to render them unusable and left buried in snowdrifts. Then the supply wagons had to be abandoned as the draft animals perished. The army's treasury, containing millions of gold francs meant to pay the troops, was dumped into a frozen lake to prevent Cossack raiders from capturing it. The wealth Napoleon had brought to purchase supplies and cooperation simply vanished into the Russian ice. Cossack light cavalry harassed the flanks of the retreating columns constantly, cutting down stragglers like wolves culling wounded prey. But the bitter cold and relentless hunger were the real killers, far more deadly than enemy action. The army that had marched confidently into Russia with 600,000 men was reduced to a spectral column of shivering, frostbitten skeletons shuffling westward in desperate hope of survival. The economic cost of the retreat is almost impossible to calculate accurately. It wasn't merely the catastrophic loss of human life, although that toll was absolutely horrific. It was the comprehensive loss of accumulated capital built over an entire generation. The trained war horses worth fortunes, the skilled blacksmiths and armorers, the experienced sergeants who were the backbone of military effectiveness, the muskets, the boots, the wagons, the medical supplies, everything was gone, abandoned in the snow. When the remnants of the Grand Army reached the Berezna River crossing in late November, it became the final hellish scene of the tragedy. French military engineers worked in freezing water up to their chests to construct pontoon bridges, many dying of hypothermia to save their comrades, an emperor in the panic to cross before the Russians closed the trap. Thousands were trampled to death or pushed into the icy water, where they drowned or died of cold within minutes. By the time the shattered army finally staggered out of Russian territory in December, fewer than 50,000 men remained fit for any kind of duty. Napoleon had lost 90% of his workforce's human capital investment. He had lost his entire strategic investment. The largest military expedition in history had achieved absolutely nothing except its own annihilation. Napoleon abandoned his dying army in Lithuania and raced back to Paris by sleigh, desperate to reach the capital before news of the catastrophe triggered political collapse. He understood that political sharks were already circling. He had to reach the capital immediately to reassure the bankers, the politicians, and the public that he could rebuild, that the empire remained viable. But the spell of invincibility was irrevocably broken. The myth of French military supremacy lay frozen on the blood-stained road to Moscow. The Continental System trade war that had initiated this entire catastrophic sequence collapsed completely and immediately. Russia threw open its ports to British merchant ships. British goods flooded back into northern Europe like a dam bursting. The gold that Napoleon had spent on the invasion ultimately ended up in the pockets of Russian merchants, British smugglers, and international traders. Napoleon had attempted to enforce a comprehensive monopoly on the European economy, and the market had systematically destroyed him in response. He had learned the hardest possible lesson in economics. Resources are fundamentally finite, and the cost of attempting to acquire and control them can sometimes catastrophically exceed their ultimate value. The retreat from Moscow represented the greatest margin call in financial history, and the French Empire could not pay the debt it had incurred. When Napoleon Bonaparte finally arrived back in Paris in December 1812, he did not project the image of a conquered or defeated man. He looked like a man possessed with desperate urgency. He had left the frozen corpses of his Grand Army scattered across 1,000 miles of Russian wasteland, but in his relentless mind, the strategic spreadsheet was already resetting. He needed a new army, and he needed it with impossible speed. The ruthless efficiency of the French state machinery went into absolute overdrive. Napoleon called up conscripts years ahead of their scheduled draft dates. He emptied police stations and forestry services to find able-bodied men. He scoured military academies for teenage officer candidates. Astonishingly, within just a few months, he had raised another army of 300,000 men. It was an administrative miracle that demonstrated the frightening efficiency of the centralized French state. But there was a fundamental, devastating difference between a man merely holding a musket and an actual trained soldier. The army Napoleon had lost in Russia had been extraordinarily rich in human capital composed of battle-hardened veterans, skilled marksmen, experienced sergeants who had marched across thousands of miles of European territory and fought in dozens of engagements. The new army was composed primarily of teenagers and middle-aged reservists. They were brave and patriotic, but they represented essentially unskilled labor in military terms. They didn't know how to maintain their weapons properly. They couldn't judge distances for effective musket fire. They panicked under artillery bombardment. And while Napoleon could conscript men by government decree and emergency legislation, he absolutely could not conscript horses. The systematic destruction of French cavalry in Russia was an economic catastrophe from which the empire would never recover. A military horse requires approximately 5 years to breed, raise, and train to cavalry standards. You cannot accelerate that biological timeline with legislation or imperial will. France was fundamentally bankrupt of horses. This meant the new army was strategically blind. It lacked adequate cavalry for reconnaissance and screening operations. It had no shock troops for exploitation of battlefield breakthroughs. It was essentially an army of infantry that could hold defensive ground but could not pursue and destroy a defeated enemy to achieve strategic victory. Meanwhile, across the English Channel, the British government was making its decisive strategic move. They recognized that the French colossus had been gravely wounded. They understood instinctively that now was the optimal moment to finish what they had started. London did not dispatch a massive army to continental Europe. They sent something far more strategically powerful. They sent gold. Vast quantities of gold. The Chancellor of the Exchequer opened the deep vaults of the Bank of England. The British government issued massive loans and direct subsidies to Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden. They were essentially hiring the armies of Europe to fight Napoleon on Britain's behalf. This strategy became known colloquially as the Cavalry of St. George, a sardonic reference to the gold sovereign coin stamped with the image of St. George slaying the dragon. British diplomats traveled to the courts of Berlin, Vienna, and St. Petersburg with one simple, powerful message. They placed literal stacks of gold coins on the negotiating tables. They paid for every musket, every cannonball, every cavalry, saber, every uniform, and every ration that the coalition armies would use against France. It was the ultimate vindication of the British system of public credit and financial markets over the French system of military plunder and coerced tribute. Napoleon had always financed his wars by systematically looting the countries he occupied and forcing them to pay tribute. But he had already stripped Germany, Italy, Poland, and the Low Countries virtually dry over the previous decade. He had no remaining revenue streams to exploit. His treasury was running on fumes. Britain, conversely, financed the war by borrowing enormous sums from its own wealthy merchant and landowning classes, who willingly purchased government bonds because they fundamentally trusted the British state to honor its debts and repay with interest. It was a sustainable model based on credit and confidence rather than conquest and extraction. In 1813, the War of the Sixth Coalition commenced in earnest. It was fundamentally a war of economic resources and financial endurance. The sheer crushing weight of numerical superiority, funded entirely by British pound sterling, began systematically grinding down the French military machine. At the Battle of Leipzig in October 1830, known to history as the Battle of Nations, Napoleon was decisively defeated. It wasn't primarily a tactical or operational failure on his part. He maneuvered his forces brilliantly given the circumstances. It was a fundamental failure of material resources. He literally ran out of artillery ammunition during critical phases of the battle. He had no strategic reserves to commit at decisive moments. His Saxon allies, who had been coerced into the French coalition, suddenly defected in the middle of the battle, switching sides. Not primarily for ideological reasons, but because their leadership clearly recognized that the French Empire had become a sinking ship that could no longer protect their commercial and security interests. The retreat from Leipzig definitively marked the end of the French Empire's control over territories beyond France's natural borders. The continental system, that grandiose trade war that had initiated the entire catastrophic sequence, was completely and irreversibly dead. The ports of Europe threw open their gates with celebration. British merchant ships, laden with affordable coffee, sugar, cotton textiles, and manufactured goods, flooded triumphantly into Hamburg, Amsterdam, Genoa, and Naples. The local merchant communities cheered in the streets. The artificial scarcity ended overnight. Prices for consumer goods collapsed to reasonable levels. The shopkeepers had won the economic war. Napoleon retreated behind France's traditional borders for the first time in 2 decades, and for the first time in his entire reign, the war came home directly to the French civilian population. This is the moment when the domestic economy of France finally shattered completely. To finance the desperate defense of French territory itself, Napoleon was forced to tax his own people into crushing poverty. He dramatically raised land taxes. He increased the hated salt tax. He seized the savings and reserve funds of municipal governments. The French economy, which had been partially shielded from the true costs of war through foreign plunder and tribute, now had to bear the full catastrophic weight of the accumulated debt. The French people were utterly exhausted physically, emotionally, economically. They looked at their emperor and no longer saw a glorious hero leading France to greatness. They saw an increasingly desperate tax collector. They saw a man who was spending their sons' lives and their family savings on an increasingly obvious gamble that had already failed. In 1814, the Allied armies marched triumphantly into Paris itself. Russian Cossacks made camp on the elegant Champs-Élysées. Prussian soldiers bivouacked in the Tuileries Gardens. Napoleon's own marshals d'Amen, who had become fabulously wealthy under his reign, refused to continue fighting. They wanted to preserve their accumulated wealth, their estates, their titles. They essentially forced Napoleon to abdicate the throne. He was exiled to the island of Elba, off the Italian coast. The Bourbon monarchy was restored to the French throne. The Napoleonic era seemed definitively over, but there remained one final, desperate twist, one last impossible gamble. In 1815, Napoleon escaped from Elba with a handful of loyal followers. He landed on the French coast with fewer than 1,000 men. Astonishingly, the French army defected back to him en masse as he marched toward Paris. He reclaimed the throne without firing a single shot. This period became known as the 100 Days. It makes for a romantic story of loyalty and charisma, but examined economically, it was an absolute suicide mission built on pure delusion. When Napoleon arrived in Paris and reclaimed power, he discovered the national treasury was completely empty. The restored Bourbon king had fled, taking whatever portable wealth remained with him. Napoleon desperately tried to raise money through any means available. He approached the banking houses of Paris for emergency loans. They refused him categorically. They had finally learned their lesson. He was an unacceptably bad credit risk. He attempted to issue government bonds to raise funds. Virtually nobody purchased them. The market had lost all confidence. He faced the combined professional armies of Europe at Waterloo, with a military machine held together by shoestrings, patriotic fervor, and desperation. He had no financial resources for a prolonged campaign. He had to win immediately, decisively, overwhelmingly, or he would go bankrupt within mere months. At Waterloo, on June 18, 1815, the final gamble failed completely. The British infantry squares held firm against repeated French cavalry charges. The Prussian army arrived on the French flank at the critical moment. The French army rooted in panic and chaos. Napoleon surrendered to the captain of the British warship HMS Bellerophon. The symbolism was profound and fitting. He surrendered to a representative of the Royal Navy, that wooden wall of ships that had enforced the maritime blockade and systematically strangled his empire economically for 15 years. He was sent into final exile on St. Helena Tani, lonely volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic Ocean. Thousands of miles from anywhere, he would spend the remaining 6 years of his life staring at the endless ocean he had never managed to conquer. The aftermath of the Napoleonic Wars fundamentally reshaped the global economic order for the next century. The British Empire emerged as the undisputed master of the planet. The British pound became the world's primary reserve currency, a position of dominance it would maintain until the First World War. The City of London became effectively the central bank of the entire world. The Industrial Revolution, fueled by the global markets Britain had secured and expanded during the war years, accelerated dramatically. Britain used the enormous profits of the long peace to construct the Victorian world order, an era of unprecedented British economic and imperial dominance. France, conversely, was left with a comprehensively shattered economy and a demographic catastrophe that would haunt the nation for generations. The loss of so many young men in Russia, Spain, and the subsequent campaigns created a demographic hole that profoundly impacted French society for a full century afterward. The population stagnated relative to other European powers. The economy remained stubbornly agrarian and traditional. While Britain industrialized rapidly, France remained predominantly a great power of culture, art, and military tradition, but it never again seriously challenged Britain for global economic supremacy. The story of the continental system stands as the ultimate historical lesson in the fundamental futility of trade wars and economic nationalism. Napoleon definitively proved that you cannot successfully fight against market forces with political decrees and military power. He attempted to construct Fortress Eura, closed, autarkic economic zone where political diktat would dictate the flow of commerce according to imperial will. He failed catastrophically because the desire of human beings to buy and sell goods, to seek the best available prices and highest quality products, is effectively a force of nature as powerful and persistent as gravity. You can temporarily suppress it with force, but you cannot eliminate it. He thought he could economically starve the nation of shopkeepers into submission. Instead, he inadvertently forced them to become innovators, smugglers, and ultimately the victorious economic power that would dominate the 19th century. The French Empire ultimately died, not because its soldiers were cowardly or incompetent. They were among the finest fighting men in history. It died because its fundamental business model was catastrophically flawed from the beginning. It relied entirely on plunder and extraction, rather than sustainable production and voluntary trade. It relied on military coercion, rather than financial credit and market confidence. In the final accounting, the ledger always balances. Economic laws are as immutable as physical laws. Napoleon conquered dozens of capital cities and won scores of brilliant battles, but he could never conquer the compound interest accumulating in British banking houses or override the fundamental laws of supply and demand. The greatest general in military history was ultimately defeated, not by enemy armies, but by the invisible hand of economic forces he never truly understood and certainly could not control. This is the story they rarely teach in military academies or include in dramatic films. This is the untold economic history behind the grand military narrative. And this is why understanding the past from multiple perspectives, political and especially economic, is essential for comprehending how our world actually works. Subscribe and follow for more untold perspectives from history, because understanding how empires truly rise and fall is the only way to recognize the patterns before they repeat themselves.